Good afternoon. My name is Leif Stenberg, and I am the Dean of the Oct University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome you all to this conference entitled Words Laying Down the Law, Translating Arabic Legal Discourse. I'm going to do just a brief introduction to AKU and ISMC, as the abbreviations are, and then I'll leave to Professor Parolin to contextualize the conference and take it from there. As you may know, Aga Khan University was established in 1983. In the beginning, it was mostly about nursing, medicine, and a little bit later, education. This institute, the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilization, was created in 2002 with the ambition to study challenges facing Muslim societies, and it was located in London in order to kind of be in a platform, or do that from a platform where it could be to some extent independent. Today, AKU is about 15,000 employees, not more than 3,500 students, mainly because we still are very heavy on medicine, but it's on 3 continents and in 6 countries, and I do think it's about 11 to 13 campuses at the moment. What is interesting with AKU is a transition. The university is in a transition period, and I think one can place both the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations and the governance program in that transition. The transition goes from to be heavy on medicine to become a liberal arts university, and also then to establish a faculty of arts and sciences in Karachi. I think that is a challenge, and it will be very exciting to follow that type of development, and it will also be important for us as part of the university to support and to be part of such a development. Today, I also think it's important to say that AKU ISMC, the institute in London, operate on 2 basic ideas. At least I like to think so, and since I'm the dean, I think it has some relevance at least. I don't know if all of the faculty agree with me, but I do think that one of the 2 basic ideas concerns the objective to look upon Muslim everyday life as part of human life in general, as pluralistic and diverse it may be. An idea founded on the notion not to make Muslims into exceptions or different from others. And secondly, to study parts of history or the contemporary that we think are important, and then to bridge gaps in academia and the society at large. The overall aim for the institute is to better understand the diverse and rich pluralistic nature of Muslim traditions. Governance program is part of that type of study, and it's been a very prolific part, very active part of AKU and ISMC. And I think it's important for me then to leave it out to Gianluca to say more about the governance program, and I will end by instead thanking the faculty lead, Professor Parolin, for organizing the conference, and also the 3 steps here this fall that concerns language. I think it's a very interesting topic, and it's well chosen. I would like to say that I think all 3 of you, the faculty coordinator, Alimia, and our fellow of the governance program for 2019, Nancy Hawker, have done an excellent choice in topic, and I also then thank you warmly for your activities and organizing this conference. So please, Gianluca. Thank you.
Thank you, Leif. Welcome to the 4th conference of the governance program. The first was on water management in Rabat. The second in year 2 was on gender and governance here in London. We're going to soon celebrate the coming out of the book with the proceedings of the conference. The third was governance in East Africa, with special attention to Muslim minorities there in our sister campus in Nairobi. and year 4 we're back to London. The program is young and energetic, and parenting guides say that at age 5, most children, and here I start the quote, are content to play with their toys for longer periods of time, are eager to try new things, and when they get frustrated, are better able to express their emotions. This conference shows that the governance program is meeting its developmental milestone for year 5. Yay! In particular, we are here to try a new thing. It won't escape anyone that any proper engagement with matters of governance for the public good in Muslim context, our official name, cannot avoid a broader, deeper, preliminary reflection on matters of language in which governance is articulated. We therefore decided to start small with a specific angle, law and Arabic. Developments in the fields of translation studies, legal studies, Arabic linguistics have been massive in the past couple of decades. Yet conversations across disciplines has proven extremely difficult. We thus thought to invite a few speakers to give us a sense of the main issues and angles that the different disciplines see at present. We then launched an open call and meant to cast the net wide. And with plenty of exciting abstracts, we have selected the ones that are currently on the program. And I think you're in for a treat. The various papers that will be presented tomorrow will look at different issues and aspects that involve translation, language, and governance. In particular, the agency of the translator. What are the personal trajectories that define translational choices? The translator's dilemmas. Should we domesticize or foreignize what we translate? But also an emphasis on audience and readership. So considering these two elements, or this one element, audience and readership, when, for instance, translating a fiqh textbook. But also the fact that matters of governance are translated also for wider audiences. So, for instance, electoral legislation. What sort of rules should regulate, if any, should regulate the translation of these pieces of literature. There's also a couple of papers that will look at the specificities of Arabic, so specificities of style and syntax of the text or the language more broadly that affect the way in which the translation operation then occurs. And then there's the matter of international standards. In contexts where we have international standards that are set by international organizations like the UN, especially for trade, how do that affect the way in which a certain translational connection is created or established? But also the mediation of third languages. It is in context when it's not just, for instance, English and Arabic, but for instance, when we have also French that plays a role. So in contexts where the major other language is either English and French, what is the route that text in the third language take to become translated or be translated into? But also the fact that there's multi-language changing systems, and we have a case from British Mandate Palestine, in which, of course, translation is a matter of everyday life, legal translation. But then there's also a set of papers that are looking at the actual problems of pedagogy of legal translation. So what and how, what are the issues and how should legal translation be taught and where. I mean, I come from a law school in which translation is for sure not a matter that is included in the curriculum, and in very few translation studies courses there is a specific section on law. And so where do people actually learn, and how should they learn how to engage in translation of legal texts? So the question of the pedagogy, but also the questions, if you wish, in a way more practical, of the coexistence of official translations and unofficial translations. That is, how do these various texts interact with each other? And we have a case study here on 19th century Ottoman Empire and Egypt in particular. But then we also have a parallel approach of two different cultural experiences of Japan and Egypt when on the course of adapting or articulating a new semiotics of governance in the 19th century. So as you can see, the breadth of matters that we are going to engage with is extremely broad, and also, well, the breadth is broad, of course. I wonder how they would translate that. But it's also interrogates different disciplines and their different angles when they come to the discussion. Also, in terms of time, they cover time and geography, quite, from 14th century fiqh books to contemporary electoral legislation. Tonight, we begin with keynote panel that will, inshallah, help us get the discussion started. And I think that from their presentations, we'll probably already identify some of the themes that we'll keep on engaging with also tomorrow. First, a matter of, you probably haven't seen Baudouin Dupré, who is on the program but is not physically here. He unfortunately had to excuse himself for family reasons. Yet he intends on participate on in the proceedings of this conference. So he's still fully on board. He was just unfortunately unable to attend. So the idea of starting with the panel tonight was precisely to look at the various different souls of the conference, or the various different disciplines that we want to bring into this conversation. And so we have the input of translation and interpreting studies that, we'll see and we'll hear how they will engage with the matter of not just accuracy and conventions in translation, but also the relevance of practice. And so when a text has already been mediated, as in the case of a court clerk transcribing an interrogation, how does that affect, or how should that affect the way in which we actually translate that text? And also the perspective of the legal sciences, but in a way a specific position, that is the position of comparative law, that has an anti-dogmatic approach to matters legal. So you will probably not hear something about, this is how things are translated, period. So I think that what the three papers today, but also the ones tomorrow, share is a sort of critical engagement with a very multifaceted issue. I also need to tell you that the toilets are on the corridor here to the right of the room. But the most important thing that I want to underline here is that, just as the Dean mentioned, the program is small. We're 3 people. And Sana has just joined us. but our joy for the year and who has made possible also this conference, because it's the theory and the practice in different ways in which have been shaped, both the call for papers and the program, is my dear colleague Nancy Hoker, who I will give the floor to right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianluca. I don't think we're going to do a parenting test on the governance program, though. We don't know what we might find. But it really has been a privilege to be the research fellow on this program since January. I've learnt a lot from working at the Aga Khan University, and one thing in preparing this conference was that there is actual material consequence to the principles and values of the university, which are about openness and exchange of knowledge and some kind of transparency. So, and I've really appreciated that it means that people have come here from all over the world. We have speakers here who have traveled from Libya, from Palestine, from Japan, from Egypt, from the United States. And that is truly amazing to have everybody here in one room and to talk about this. And of course, it's not a geographical multiplicity. It's also a multiplicity of disciplines. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how it comes together if we focus our minds on one issue, which is the Arabic legal translation. I am a sociolinguist, I think I have to say. So I think Gianluca started to imply that I'm on the practical side of things. I do field work and I record discourse. Most of my field work has been in Palestine. It has been about language contact in that area. But what made it possible for Gianluca and I, Gianluca, who obviously has a legal training and is looking at representations of the law, is that we're interested in a translation in a broad sense, as a mediation and transposition of concepts, but still looking, from my point of view, at the materiality of language. These are real sounds and have real consequences in the world. And so, as part of my research has been about, which might be of interest to some of you, about how women's testimonies given for human rights organizations are translated from where they are collected in the field where human rights violations occur, and my area of interest, of course, is the Middle East and North Africa, and how then these testimonies are processed through the human rights knowledge infrastructure until we receive them and they are incorporated in human rights reports and then disseminated to an audience. And so in translation studies, which is where I had to go to from sociolinguistics, then we see this as a causal chain of translation, which goes through all these stages. And obviously this chain can be disassembled into the links, and I think a lot of the presentations will be very interesting to me because they look at different parts from the actual encounter where the discourse is produced to where it is reproduced, reframed, and reiterated until what I'm now trying to analyze is how the translation actually affects how people receive a women's testimonies and what kind of how they can take that knowledge then further into their knowledge of the world. So so that was our encounter, and really I've benefited from already the multidisciplinarity of the governance program. So we have a politics person in Sana, whom you'll have met downstairs, and then the kind of legal and representation of the law side with Gianluca, and then I guess I'm representing the language side of that coming somehow together, hopefully. But yes, so I am quite a practice-oriented person, so in line with that, I'm going to say a few practical things. We are recording this event, and it's going to be the camera is right here, and it will be uploaded on the website. And this is in part to allow access to this knowledge from other parts of the world, people who cannot come here. Also, all the other materials will be uploaded and freely available on our website later on. Other practical, of course, we live in a three-dimensional material world, so we have to attend to our food needs. All the food is going to be in room 110, the catering during the conference, and hot drinks are not allowed in this room. I do also have to tell you about the fire exit. So if there is, if the fire alarm sounds, then you do have to exit the room and turn left. And on the left-hand side, there's the fire stairs. And then the assembly point is, when you leave the building, it's on the right on the Levitt Square, which is to the right front of the building. But there will be a fire alarm test, not a drill. You don't have to do anything. There'll be a test at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. So we will hear it during the first panel, and we don't have to do anything. We just have to block our ears and hope that it's actually the test. Yes, so I'm really looking forward to this first panel, the way we're going to organize it is that each speaker is going to do their presentation. Then they will have a few minutes each to comment on each other's presentation in answer to the questions of the conference, which is how are these concepts translated, and what does it mean in consequence? What does a translation mean for the perception of the law and its application? And then after that, we will open it to questions from the audience, and we will finish here at 7:30. And so I think I should welcome our speakers now. Yes. Any more?
One thing that I forgot to say is that we are small, but this is possible only thanks to the many, many, many people who actually help us, from the volunteers onwards. And there's a full list of them.
So if you have any other practical questions that we can't answer, please go to the volunteers. They are here with green lanyards. And we really would like to thank them. It has been a collective effort. We have Layal here from the events team, who has really put this together. And we have the volunteers, Sadiq, Naveen, Muntaz, Malik, Nourani, and Mohammed here. And they will be also here tomorrow, both at the registration and the hospitality. So that is all done by volunteers who support the events at this center. Thank you for reminding me about that. Yeah. Anything else?
Let's get started.
Let's get started. So first speaker tonight is Professor Miriam Salama Carr from the University of Manchester, who is going to tell us about translating and interpreting law. Sorry. That's because we haven't put it in. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't make the clicker work. You can use this, I guess.
Hello, everyone. Of course, I would like to start by thanking the Aga Khan University and the conference organizers for inviting me to participate in I think, what promises to be a very, really a thought-provoking event. As a translation studies researcher and practitioner, my knowledge of and involvement with legal translation has been sporadic, to some extent, but I have felt a growing awareness of the importance of legal translation in my research and in my practice. My interest is motivated by the way translation studies as a discipline, or as a disciplinary area, has been engaging increasingly with the wider picture, i.e. not just linguistics, although linguistics in itself is a rather formidable field, but it has increasingly explored the role of the translator and the interpreter as a mediator. Translators and interpreters are as engaged participants, sometimes activists themselves, which of course bring to the fore the issue of rights, and namely human rights, but not just human rights. So in the context of my research, it's also motivated by my own interest in the debate about the possible extension and development of rights, and specifically the extension of rights to non-human animals, which of course has huge legal implications. So taking translation studies as as a field of translation studies as a point of departure, I will focus on some of the ways the discipline has engaged with legal translation, and then I will move on to discuss the role of language mediation in the shaping of legal concepts and terms, with particular reference to historical accounts and, of course, with reference to the current debates on the issue of animal rights and animal welfare. All of this in 20 minutes. So the definition of legal language as a form of specialized or technical language has been debated in translation studies, translation and interpreting studies. Cao 2012 offers a rather inclusive definition, whereby legal language refers not only to the language of the law, but also to the language related to the legal process, which of course brings in many more actors, agents, and of course text types. On the other hand, Sarcevich 1997 has focused on legal text for specialists only. So we have a sort of a range of approaches to legal language and legal translation. Various manuals, don't want to go backwards, have been published with focus on specific language pairs and translator training. So moreover, the intersection of language and law has been particularly clear in interpreting encounters, and the development of forensic linguistics, for instance, has helped to focus on issues of court, police interpreting, for example. Legal translation in the discipline is increasingly seen as a communicative act. Legal translatability, of course, is sometimes contested, not normally from within the discipline, actually. But what is increasingly stressed is the need for cultural mediation. So in a context of globalization, knowledge transfer and exchange of really growing international interconnectedness, translation is everywhere, whether relatively controlled and professionalized or not, which is a reality of the translation world that we have to live with. Michael Cronin, in his study of translation in the digital age, has even suggested that the knowledge society should be more properly be termed the translation age. This, of course, entails the drafting of volumes of legislative material and their multilingual implications. The translation of legal discourse has a key role to play, with particular urgency when issues of human rights are at stake. And I would add, when the world is burning literally. So this highly visible, if not necessarily an entirely new urgency, can explain to some extent the increased interest showed in legal translation, both from a theoretical point of view and a practical one. Legal translation is now addressed in specific entries in handbooks and encyclopedias of translation studies, which is a relatively new phenomenon. The very well-known, well-established Routledge Encyclopedia of Translation Studies, which was first published in 1998, allocates an entry to legal translation in the third and latest edition, which is the 2019 edition. Although some approaches developed in a translational perspective might be seen as perhaps reductionist when they appear to focus solely on issues of linguistic accuracy and conventions, particularly when dealing with practice. See, for instance, the work of Alcaraz and Hughes. The principle of legal equivalence has also been challenged. And law, of course, is seen as a social construct. According to Gemar 1995, each legal system has a specific terminology which reflects the idiosyncrasy of a given culture and its historical evolution. So this is something that we have to sort of set against the claim of universality, of course. Other researchers have opened more interdisciplinary research avenues and engaged with the centrality of legal translation, as other types of translation, in the construction and dissemination of knowledge, and in the historical grounding of this construction. Dullion 2018 argues that legal history can be a source of knowledge about translation. I think the work that is done in the context of the Genealogies of Knowledge project, which is based at the University of Manchester, and I'll have some leaflets to leave at the end of the conference, is an example of this role of the importance of genealogy of knowledge. Moreover, the role and positioning of the interpreter in human rights contexts has also promoted the need for interdisciplinary approaches. What is in my view is particularly important is for the process of translation. So it can be seen in all its complexity, which goes beyond the mere transfer of words, terms from one language to another. In the same way as interpretation of the law steps in when the meaning of a legal text or concept must be determined, the translation process itself is often conceptualized as an interpreting act. And the interpreter and translator as seen as situated agent in the process. In contrast, I would like to use an example. Is this okay? Right, the illusion of transparency. I came across a discussion of the Arab Charter of Human Rights. So this discussion is found in a 1996 issue of the International Commission of Jurists. The Charter was reviewed in 2004. As far as I am aware, it has not been ratified yet by all interested parties, or all parties who should be interested, I should say. But I'm taking this example because in the review, the discussion is about articles that are not, or types of rights that are not included in the Charter, and it is fair that they should be there. But what's interesting from a purely translational point of view is that the official text, the only official text is the Arabic one. It is not provided in the article. but we are given an unofficial translation of the basic text, which I am quite uncomfortable with. You know, the idea of discussing a legal text or constitutional text without reference to this official text. And to me, this is an example of perhaps what has been called the illusion of transparency, that translation is transparent, and this is not the case. The study of translated legal texts can offer particular insights into the history of ideas. In a special issue of a Journal of Translation, which I recently guest edited, Van Gerwen sets out to address the under-researched role of institutional and legal translation in the history and historiography of translation. Her article, Describing and Explaining Legal Translations in History, the Case of 19th Century Belgium, offers an interdisciplinary perspective, drawing on legal and social history as well as translation studies to study legal translation practices and their socio-cultural impact in terms of access of citizens to legislation and their participation in political life. Still looking at the historical perspective and from the point of view of Arabic, it is difficult to bypass the work of Rafa al-Tahtawi. In the context of the early Egyptian Nahda and of course his translation of the French 1814 Constitutional Charter, presented and commented in his iconic essay Tahlis Libris fi Tahlis Paris. This has to be seen as well in the context of the followed on by the 1901 Arabic translation of the French 1789 Declaration of Human and Civic Rights by the Lebanese Syrian writer Farah Hantoun, and there's also the work of Adib Ishaq, more of a literary man, but who has grappled with the notion of freedom and what freedom represents. So from a translational perspective, al-Tahtawi's work is important not only in terms of its production and effect on translator training, for instance, in Egypt, but also because it belongs to a discourse on translation which is anchored in early 19th century Egypt and is drawing its legitimacy and authority from past practices. Of course, the well-known translation movement in Baghdad in the 9th and 10th century. And all these apart from these sort of political contingencies that impacted on his work. And of course, I will, here I will refer to our colleague, Professor Parolin, who shows how the 1814 Constitutional Charter, how the translator negotiates the terms into Arabic, drawing on Islamic jurisprudence to do so, and using different terms at different times, sort of operating subtle distinctions between Qanun and Sharia. Retracing the history and genealogy of texts dealing with human rights in Arabic, researchers such as Schreiby and Bush sketch the continuity and ruptures that define the interpretation of legal or legal-related terms. Bush suggests, I quote, that there were some changes and differences in how Arab intellectuals conceived of freedom during the 19th century. Farah Hantoun, for instance, posited secularism as central to the possibility of freedom, whilst Rashid Reda drew on Islam to explain freedom. And some have argued that, for instance, Adib Ishaq has influenced the language of the discourse of the Arab Spring, the Arab Spring movement. But what is striking when we look at those two translators is how their engagement in cultural mediation is underpinned by their political and philosophical allegiances. So legal translation, or more accurately, the translation of particular legal terms and concepts, is definitely not taking place in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. I will now talk about animal rights, and you may think that this is a rather abrupt change, but I would just, would like to mention that El-Tahtawi himself had a few things to say about the way animals were treated in 19th century Paris, and it's quite interesting. I mean, some of the references have to do with the way horses were being treated by horse carriage drivers in the streets of Paris, but there are also some references to slaughtering practices. So food for thought. So he was commenting on the harshness of treatment. Growing public concern about animal welfare, and particularly in the context of the sort of industrial exploitation of animals, the abusive breeding, slaughtering practices is increasingly politicized. And there is also a kind of a shift of focus from the idea of welfare to that of animal rights. So we're sort of going much more into a legal realm, moving from compassion to ethics. And this is framed in an increasingly vocal political discourse. Animal activism has been described as the fastest growing social movement, and it's itself highly varied and complex. It is embodied in political organizations. One example is the Party for the Animals, which is present in a number of European countries, but is also present in Turkey, for instance, and Australia. There is now a call for a more integrated vision of animal rights that connects to other issues such as gender, race, economics, and of course the environment. It's all part of the same package. Gardner actually points out that many women activists recognize and are motivated by the connection between the oppression of animals and other social injustice. So as Robert Jones claims, animal rights is a social justice issue. Okay. I will have to move quite fast, but the political aspect can be seen, and going into the legislation. For instance, the discussions that took place in this country about 3 years ago after the exiting the EU referendum. Discussions in Parliament about whether the term of animal sentience should be kept or not in the new legislation that was in the withdrawal bill, arguing that the term, the concept was already present in the Animal Welfare Act, the UK Animal Welfare Act. So this concept of sentience is quite key to the discussion of animal rights, but it is not. There's some disagreement as what how it should be translated in other languages. There is now an established concept of the 5 freedoms in animal welfare, and what happens here is that the cultural and social context in which animal protection organizations operate is highly relevant to understand their actions. Clark's stressed, for instance, the importance of engagement with the local context, arguing that it is important that those who campaign for international change should find the appropriate seeds of ecological and humanitarian change within the customs of the relevant country. And this approach is actually illustrated by the work of a number of organizations in the Muslim world, which, for instance, will justify or promote kindness to animals by referring to religious principles and texts, which is one way of approaching it. So stressing compassion and mercy rather than the notion of right. One such example is the Egyptian SPARE organization, which is quite an active, vocal organization of protection of animals, which makes sure to legitimizes its action by asking for support from the religious authorities, which is quite an interesting way of packaging this. Another example is provided by the work of the Palestinian League for Animals, which includes the notion of compassion in its, using the term rifq in its name. But this organization also provides a very interesting perspective on the interconnectedness of different struggles. So the Palestinian Animal League tackles the problem of animal abuse and neglect, but they see this as part of a wider context of occupation, the occupation of Palestine, what it entails, and how, and it focuses on education of children. And interestingly, their site is multilingual. Okay. I think I have to stress that there is a Universal Declaration of Animal Rights as well. One other example, this time it is the Egyptian constitution dealing with capturing the concept of welfare. So if, the term used here is el-rifq, again, el-rifq al-haywan, so the idea of compassion, which is translated into, the English version of the Egyptian, or the humane treatment of animals. So again, I think I would assume, not being but from the point of view of law, there is a problem here at universal level. Is humane treatment and compassion the same as welfare? And perhaps to conclude on the centrality of law and legal instruments in developing animal welfare and possibly rights, and given that the animal rights debate is a global debate, I will refer to the world ranking of countries. So there is a world ranking of countries in terms of animal protection. It's worth checking because you can have nice surprises. Well, not nice or not so nice surprises. But what is interesting, I think, in this context, is that the ranking is based not so much on the facts on the ground, but on the legislation that has actually been put into place, whether the legislation is there or not. So again, that shows how those, the term needs to embed themselves in all this material. I have to wrap up at this stage, perhaps by suggesting that translation of choices have an impact on how social viewpoints are developed, and this applies to animal rights, to other claims. From the examples I have sort of given, I think we can also see that the input of general language to legal language is crucial, and the other way around, and this will happen by translation. And what is also, I think, quite clear is that the legal interpreter or translator, or the translator-interpreter who has to deal with this type of material, has to bridge a gap between a universal discourse as enshrined in international organizations and localized discourses, and of course at the national or regional level. I'll stop at this. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Salama Kar, and of course we'll give you another chance to speak about the presentations that we're going to hear. Could I invite now Dr. Naveen Al-Said from Al Ain Shams University, Cairo, please, to talk about Egyptian interrogation records, considerations for translation.
All right. Okay, I would like to start with thanking you for having me and inviting me for this important conference, I think. And I'll start the talk with a little bit of anecdote, okay? So before starting my PhD studies, I was invited by a colleague to go to a prosecutor because he has a case of a terrorist attack, okay? And they have caught the terrorists, supposedly, but he's an English-speaking terrorist and he does not understand Arabic. That's what his claim was at the point. And the prosecutor, when I went to the office, he said, okay, don't worry, I am a bilingual, so I'll do all of the talk. But while you're listening, tell me what you think he's saying. Okay, and that was the end of the instructions. Now, this is a problematic for many, many reasons, because I, at that point, was a lay person. I had nothing to do with law, okay, and I was not given any information about what the case was about, what did he do exactly, what are we trying to get out of the situation. As a lay person, the information that you get about legal contexts in Egypt would be from three sources. One of them is movies and TV series, and that is problematic because they are very distorted, okay? Depending on the director, of course, the historical context. So you either get someone like the second picture on your left, a nice police officer who's humane and he's always trying to help suspects and victims, or you would get someone who would be so aggressive, and which one you can choose it depends on your experience. Another source would be again novels, works of art, like the two we have here, Al-Lajna by Sun'Allah Ibrahim, and another Sudanese writer, Muslim al-Hijra ila al-Shamal, Al-Tayyib Saleh, and both of these have scenes where we have interrogations, okay, and again, it's a little bit based on the experience of the writer and what's the message that he's trying to send across. And more recently, you get blog posts, press releases, research publications, and Facebook posts, and this is really big in Egypt, Facebook posts, about people's experiences in the interrogation room. But that's the end of it. So if you are not working in the legal context, you will not really know how the interrogation room looks like. So if you're not a legal professional, okay, that's where you get your information. Which brings me back to the idea of what you think he is saying. Okay, so do I do this because I think police officers and prosecutors are bad? Good. Where do I stand? Okay. So this brought about the idea of my research from that moment till now on what police interrogations are and how to make them less opaque for people who do not work in the legal context, and how to make them more productive and credible for the people. So today's talk is about Egyptian interrogations and as an example of texts that translators face. And we're going to focus on the linguistic and textual issues that we face while translating this text from Arabic to English, which will bring us to the issues of the record making to begin with. Okay? And what I'm most interested in is the practical significance of this. So not only am I looking at insights into the legal system, but I am trying to decrease the gap between legal professionals and lay people through this translation. Okay? So if we look at previous research that looked at interrogations in general as a form of legal language, we have a lot of people who looked at definition of legal language, what it is, what it means, and one of the important people in that is Turismo. In 2008, he talked about this definition and the unique features that follow from the term of legal language. And then you move to the different variations of the form of legal language, whether it's spoken or written or a hybrid. Okay? And then moving to the translation context, how does this unique feature of legal language become a very complex thing to deal with? Okay? And then you get more recently people focusing on interpretation in either interrogation rooms or in the court in general. Okay? But from all of those, we have people who have focused on suspects and their rights. Okay? Did they understand their caution or their Miranda rights? Do they understand their rights in the room? What to say? What are they allowed not to say anything? And the effect, as we were listening now, of the cultural and the historical concepts on contexts and how they are related in the interrogation room. But my focus today is on challenges of translating, okay, such a text, because it is not from the point of view of the suspect and his rights, but a translator and his rights. What does he need to know about the text? Okay. One thing I would like to focus on is the hybridity of the text. What is interesting about interrogations in general, but specifically the Egyptian context, is that it's a spoken text, which moves to become a written text. Okay, so we have a prosecutor asking questions and a clerk sitting next to him taking notes, which then moves from a written text to a spoken text again used in the context of a courtroom. So already it's very complex. Okay, how many levels of textual travel do we have here? And once you have a translator, that's a further fourth step of a textual travel. Let's have a look at how this translates. Now my data quickly. It's very interesting how I collected my data. It's all through personal contacts, because in Egypt it's a bit of a taboo issue to collect interrogations if you're not from the legal person. So my first attempt was to go to lawyers. Okay, so I talked to criminal lawyers, and they just gave me photocopied pages, which was not very useful to work with. But then my second attempt was to go to judges, and then I got questions like, "Are you a spy?" Or "You're a female, you should go and have fun. Why do you bore yourself with these details?" With a little bit of a tap on the shoulder. And then my third and final attempt was a prosecutor general in the Supreme Court, and he read a lot about forensic linguistics, and that resulted in me getting 15 cases, which was great. I kept in contact with this prosecutor, and then while I was doing that, a book by Ahmed Chalabi came out in 2012, and he published the interrogations that we Mubarak and his sons had in 2011, which brought my cases up to 18. Now I have more, but that's what my data where my data comes from. Now we need to know that there are no audio recordings of the interrogation transcripts, no video recording. All of the records are handwritten, and they are written simultaneously while the prosecutor is speaking. The clerk is supposed to have a verbatim record of what's going on. To give you a view of what kind of handwritten data looks like this. Okay. Sometimes you can't read it, sometimes you can, but you work with what you get. Okay, so the examples I'm going to show you right now will look something like this. You'll have the original text on the first line, and then you have a transliteration, a word-for-word gloss, although I removed that in the last minute because for the purposes of this talk it's not useful. Idiomatic translation, which is very interesting also when you do I follow what's written exactly? Do I explain, okay, where does this come in? Line number and then who is speaking. So in that case, it's a prosecutor number 1, for example. Okay. So challenge number 1 for a translator who's going to look at such a text is understanding how did it come to creation, like where does it come from. So one important person to talk about is the transcriber, the clerk, who is sitting next to the prosecutor. He has a very important role, but you need to know right now he is not trained linguistically at all on how to take records. Okay, police records are not always verbatim, because even with good intentions, let's put any bad intentions aside, but you as a transcriber come in and you change a little bit according to what you hear, because you're putting your perspective, your ideological perspective while you are transcribing. So transcripts in the Egyptian context, they don't have hesitations, they don't have pauses, they don't have overlaps. You don't know if something was repeated or not. You just have the record. And that is problematic for a translator and any kind of analysis if you'd like. So the handwritten record is the only source of information that you have of what went on in the room. Now, so this kind of repeats of what I was saying. So political and ideological act from the part of the clerk. Okay? Challenge number 2. So once you know that this text has the idea of textual travel, so it has traveled a lot before you receiving it as a translator, you then start making decisions according to the linguistic features that you have. Are these really what was said in the room, or were they the contribution of the clerk, keeping in mind that the prosecutor himself could stop the clerk from writing and telling him what to write. So for example, no, write it in this way, it's better. Again, with good intentions, if we take it in that perspective. Okay, so some linguistic features that you can face is the idea of archaic or technical terms. Okay, so things like in the example that we have in front of us, سالف الذكر. Okay, so these are legal terms, and if you have someone as a suspect from the legal context, that would be perfectly fine. But then you have people who are illiterate, uneducated, and they are asked this question. So how would they understand, okay, the question that is asked? Of course, Salif al-Dhikr is a bit simplistic here, but I have more problematic terms. Okay, another example would be a drugs case here, and you have هل وقفت على شخصية القائمين بالتعدي عليك. Again, وقفت is not a regular, and if you know the Egyptian dialect, that's something that you don't use in the Egyptian dialect at all. وقفت here means عرفت. Okay, do you know who they were? So again, keep in mind that you have someone who's sitting in front of you, and he does not, in that specific case, they were two brothers and both were illiterate. They have received no education at all. Okay, so how would you translate that? Would you translate it as no, or would you translate it with a note that this is a weird term? What would you do? Okay. Another thing that you might face are spelling and register shifts. Again, clerks made a lot of grammatical vocabulary mistakes when taking the record down. So what would I do as a translator? Would I correct them? How would I translate them without correcting them? Another important and I found very interesting is the idea of diglossia. In Arabic, you have different registers that work and complement each other. So you have the classical Arabic, and then you have modern standard Arabic, and then you have colloquial Egyptian Arabic with many levels within each of these. But then when you are dealing with the text or the records, you would find that prosecutors usually use modern standard Arabic on paper. Okay? So, and because it is the official sort of language that is used, then you think it's perfectly fine. But then suspects, on the other hand, or even witnesses, they could use them interchangeably. Okay? But if, again, the suspect is illiterate, then how would you explain having this kind of high variety of the language used in front of you? And how would you explain this as a translator? Would you, again, give a note about it? Okay? There is no, unfortunately, trace in the records of whether this was the actual words of the suspect, or were they changed by the clerk, or was that the suggestion of the prosecutor who was asking the question. So you see, there are many levels of problems here. So a very simple example is ما عنديش فكرة عن هذه الإجراءات. So here you have a mix between two. This was a politics context. So the person who was speaking was a lawyer, and he is very well versed in modern standard Arabic and in the legal context as well. So would you say that ما عنديش فكرة وبعدين قال هذه الإجراءات, or was this by the clerk, or but it's not problematic. But if you have this was a beating that led to death case, and both of them, again, the suspects were two people, illiterate, who killed a friend because he bullied them. Okay? And then they said something like هو أنا وأخي, which is very funny also in the Egyptian context. You would say أنا وأخويا. Okay? But أنا وأخي, there you go. A problem in the text. One final thing that I'd like to show you is the idea of punctuation, and I think people like Al-Farahati, who dealt with translating legal text, they let me put it in they highlighted, okay, that punctuation is a problem when you are dealing with texts in Arabic. So that was an embezzlement case, and you have a big chunk just connected with where. Okay, with no punctuation whatsoever, which is very normal in Arabic. But then if you are translating, and that's a very short part of the statement. This statement went on for 2 pages of the suspect talking about, like giving a narrative about his crime. Yeah. So how would you deal with that? Okay. One form that I've used is I give a footnote of the text, because they had a lot of intertextual references also to other witness statements and other things, so it got very complicated. So would I say that the original text has a lot of where, but then I connected it better using other things? Maybe that's another way. But basically, what I wanted to show you today is that it's not, there are many considerations to keep in mind when you are translating an interrogation record. It's not just the text in front of you. There are important ethical obligations, I'm almost done, ethical obligations that you keep in mind. Okay, so should I be very true to the text in front of me, even if I know that as a record, it's not it's a very problematic record, or do I just keep to it because I'm not a human rights activist, which while I was listening to you, I was thinking of. Okay, so I'm not going to defend the suspect. I'm not a lawyer. I am just a translator. Do I need to know? And this is part of the training that I am giving at the moment. Do I need to train people? Because if you remember the story I started with, they got someone who spoke English, and that's not good enough. So do I need to train them? What do I need to train translators to actually look out for in the text. And do I need to identify as a human rights person in that case or not? These are all important questions to keep in mind if you're a translator, specifically working in an Egyptian context or similar context where you don't really get enough information to get a proper translation of the text. And that's about it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Said. And I'd like to invite Professor Aloufi from the University of Turin, who will speak about law lost in translation from the point of view of a legal comparatist.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Aga Khan University, the organizer, and namely Professor Parolin, for inviting me here to, I was said, to represent the comparative legal science. So, as far as comparative lawyers are concerned, language, no less than law, is the main focus of their attention. To a great extent, law is language. Now, the relation between a specific system, legal system I mean, and a specific language is intimate, even though it is not always exclusive. A single legal system may be expressed in multiple languages. Think of the EU legal system, for example, and different legal systems may share the same language. Both Belgian law and French law are expressed in French, even if Belgian law is also a multilingual legal system. Arabic is at the same time the legal language of, say, Egypt and Tunisia. Now, when two legal systems share the same language, there is no place for translation. But in a way, a certain degree of linguistic opacity results from the existence of a specific legal lexicon in each state and country. The same term or expression may have different meanings according to the country we are in. Let's take, for example, the word kafala. Alongside its traditional meaning of warrant, the word has acquired new ones. In the Gulf states, it means sponsorship in immigration law. By contrast, in the Maghreb countries, it refers to a specific form of child protection. We can have different Arabic terms used in different systems to mean the same concept. For example, in contract law, deceit, well, it's tahrir in Tunisia, tadlis in Morocco. Normally, comparison anyway requires the use of different languages. And if we can state, as it has already been said, that translation is necessary for legal comparison, that is to say interpretation, is necessary to a good and sound legal translation. It's not by chance that a scientific approach to legal translation has been developed in those countries which are multilingual, as Canada, for example, or European Union. Now, comparative lawyers need to be aware of the relation between law and language and need to be conscious of pitfalls and traps of legal translation. These pitfalls are normally hidden in ingenuous, naive assumptions. And I'm going this evening to discuss two of these assumptions. The first one, it is commonly believed that the greatest difficulties in legal translation are legal technicalities, that is to say, these hyper-specialized terms, this cryptic terminology, which is the everyday toolbox of a lawyer. But this is not always the case. Sometimes the terms that legal terminology shares with common language are much more tricky. The second assumption is that legal discourse is cold and objective, and that legal terms have only literal and objective, explicit, let's say, meanings. This is not necessarily the case, once more. Legal terms may have additional meanings involving emotions and cultural implications. Connotations of legal terms should never be overlooked by translators. Now, let's start with the traps to avoid when translating terms that legal terminology shares with common language. The difficulty of their translation is normally underestimated because the native speakers consider their meaning as obvious and consequently natural and universally understandable. Let's make an experiment and take the title, this one, yes. The title of our conference, Words Laying Down the Law. If we try to translate it into Arabic, I think that the solutions will be numerous. We shall hesitate when we come to law, but this hesitation ends up in involving the entire expression to lay down the law. This is the same hesitation felt by those reformers who, about 100 years ago, established the first Western-type institution for legal education in the Arab world. The French Faculté de Droit became Kulliyat al-Huquq. The English law school, the Madrasat al-Huquq. If we try to literally back-translate into English, these translations into English, we get a bizarre result, Faculty of Rights and School of Rights. Actually, the back translation into French, Faculté des Droits, sounds less weird, were it not for the plural instead of the singular, Faculté des Droits instead of Faculté de Droit. In fact, in French, the same term, droit, corresponds to both right and law. In order to distinguish the two meanings of the word, French legal scholars specify that the term droit can be understood either in an objective sense, and then it corresponds to law, or in a subjective sense, and then it corresponds to right. As for Arabic, this experiment clearly shows that while the translation of right is sure and straightforward, that for law is rather puzzling. We would search in vain for a term as broad in meaning as the English law, not to mention the French droit. Arabic actually affords different terms that mean respectively the rules given by law, by God. For me, law is God. Rules given to us by God, Sharia, the rules emanating from the political ruler or the state, Qanun, the ancestral customary rules, Urf. I'm sorry for the result. I don't know what happened. Maybe in the transferring of the
Yes, there was another
PowerPoint.
translation here. Yeah.
It's not a translation. I'm really sorry. It was not like that. Now, Sharia, Qanun, and Urf represent three discrete, separate, and non-homogeneous domains. Their rules are different in nature. In Arabic, there is no linguistic means to reduce them to a single category or to allow us to think them as a whole. In other words, law is not a semantic universal, to the surprise of European lawyers. The challenge of translating law into Arabic inevitably spreads to all the related terms like legal lawyer, legal scholar, jurist, and so on. Let's consider, for example, some English texts translated from Arabic. What does legal mean in the following expression? Marriage is a legal contract, provided that there are not legal impediments to marriage, the accepted legal proof, legal majority, condition contrary to legal rules. It is of vital importance for lawyers to know whether the Arabic texts refer to Sharia or Qanun. And how shall we call the graduate from Western-style institutions of legal education, the Kulliyat al-Huquq? The first term who came to mind was obviously faqih. But because of its association with the legal or religious science of fiqh, the word was likely to lead to ambiguities. So, to avoid misunderstandings, Sanhuri, the great Egyptian lawyer, suggests to call him lawyer, anyway, suggests to call him al-faqih al-jadid. Following these examples of these trends, certain vocabulary give us a double definition of faqih. On the one hand, he is a religious lawyer, canonist, expert in Sharia al-Islamiyya. On the other hand, he is a secular lawyer, jurist, huquqi, expert in the science of Qanun. And we could go on looking for the term in the English-Arabic dictionaries. And so we can find the opposition between faqih and alim qanuni, or muhamin, lawyer, avocat, which is a term that properly indicates the modern jurist, as it is clear that the muhami is trained in qanun. Counsel played no role in Shari procedures. But not all the modern trained lawyers are muhamin. They may be academic lawyers or judges. So, Rijal al-Qanun, we have a gender problem there. We have expressions where the explanatory function prevails, as for example, Mujaz bil Qanun, or the person who yumaris al-mihna al-qanuniya, and so on. It's a puzzle. But let me spend just 2 words about urf. I've already said that the English term law covers not only Sharia and Qanun, but also urf. Nevertheless, customary law is a marginal topic when we come to the relation between law and language. This is because of the very nature of custom. The nature of urf is masterfully described by Ibn Khaldun, whose reputation as a historian and statesman unjustly overshadows his merits as a legal scholar. To my knowledge, Ibn Khaldun is the only classical author who shapes a concept coextensive with law and calls it wazir. On the basis of a functionalist approach, he holds that every human society, in order to survive, needs a wazir, a restraining influence. This wazir is normally al-Qanun, he says. During the lifetime of the Prophet, it was Sharia. But in some societies, namely the Bedouin society, the restraining influence is the chief, who, exerting his authority with kindness, rifqat, and justice, manages to preserve al-asabiyya, the group feeling and cohesion. Unlike al-Qanun, al-Sharia, both al-Qanun and al-Sharia consist of ahkam, rules, provisions. The restraining influence in Bedouin society do without ahkam. Custom is not verbal. It is not laid down in words. It is linguistically amorphous. Custom, due to its non-verbal nature, is not part of the legal discourse and consequently is not an object for translators. Rather, it can be verbalized, it can be given a verbal shape or form, but this is a different challenge. It is not translation. I had wazir on my slide. Anyway, I'm sorry. No, it's me. I can go anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's
Here
see
we
if
are.
it goes. It was there. It was there.
Wazir.
Okay.
Thank you. No, it's okay. Let's come now to the second assumption about the supposed objective meaning of legal terms. Legal terms are not always emotionally neutral. They may evoke emotions, hint at specific cultural patterns, value systems, and convey finer shades of meaning along with their main meaning, literal meaning, or denotative meaning. It may happen that a legal term is in the source language exactly matches a legal term in the target language as far as their main meaning is concerned, but their connotations or secondary meanings may be seriously dissonant, and difference in connotations prevent a satisfactory use of the two terms in translations. Let's take, for example, the term talaq. It literally corresponds to the term repudiation. But the Arabophone clearly sensed that this English word has a negative connotation, as if it contained a judgment of inadequacy and backwardness. When speaking in a European language, they prefer to avoid this term, going so far as to transform the intransitive French verb divorcer into a transitive one. Elle a été divorcée. it is impossible in French to say so. The concern about the pejorative connotation of the word repudiation involves also official translators. In Morocco, for example, the French official translation of the Mudawanat al-Usra of 2004, unlike the code of the 50s, avoids the word repudiation, even if the Arabic text retains the opposition talaq, tatliq. In the French text, this opposition becomes divorce sous contrôle judiciaire pour talaq versus divorce judiciaire pour tatliq. The Moroccan official translator wanted to get rid of the negative perception and stigmatization attached to the word repudiation by Europeans, and in particular judges and lawyers, and to emphasize the wide-ranging and large-scale reforms introduced by the new statute on the point of marriage dissolution. But the cumbersome solution led to other problems. The French text becomes opaque, difficult to manage for someone who is not familiar enough with the traditional rules. As one can say in English, I think, in the dark all cats are grey. So in Italy it happened that an Italian judge took the shiqaq divorce for a talaq, and consequently he refused to recognize the newly introduced egalitarian and non-discriminatory form of divorce, shiqaq, for its being allegedly contrary to ordre public, as if it were a repudiation. So an alternative solution does exist that allows to maintain the binary distinction between the two categories of talaq and tatliq. It consists in leaving the word talaq untranslated, keeping it opposed to divorce. The distinction is important for the appropriate application of the statute, as the statute maintains different sets of rules to be applied to talaq and tatliq respectively. In the Moroccan case, moreover, the distinction is also important for the exact understanding of the scope of royal powers. According to the preamble of the code, the commander of the faithful cannot forbid what God has permitted. Talaq is assumed as permitted by God. More specifically, with reference to talaq, the king can, at most, put it under judicial supervision to control and restrict abusive, arbitrary practices of the husband. This is a quotation. But the king cannot transform it into a tatliq, a divorce. The untranslated term talaq sounds unusual to non-Arabophones, and unlike repudiation or repudiation, does not produce deep emotional reactions. Moreover, this solution has already been tested for the Hebrew word get, meaning a type of unilateral marriage dissolution very, very similar to talaq. Now, despite this similarity, in Western courts, get is handled in a much more balanced and relaxed way than talaq. Maybe it's just a matter of words. In this case, translators can contribute to solve the problem, refraining from translating. In some cases, this is the best solution for translations. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alufi. And I'd like to invite all the panelists to come back to the table, please. Oh, yeah, that's your vote. Yeah. So I think that gave us an idea of the breadth of material that we have to deal with, from historical translations to interrogations in the Egyptian police system, and then to specific problems of legal wording. And we came together to discuss specific problems of Arabic legal translation, and part of it is to do with whether the translation affects our understanding and vice versa, and how this is represented in different modes of communication. But first of all, I'd like to ask our panelists if they have any reactions, possibly to point out the similarities between the different disciplines of translation studies, pragmatics or discourse analysis, and legal analysis that could be, let's say, common for, and maybe then pointing out the differences as well. But in order to start answering the questions we asked ourselves. So could I ask Miriam to go first, and then we'll go as we were speaking, and then we'll open it to the audience.
Perhaps going, what struck me for a start with the discussion of interrogation record was very much the issue of training, because quite a few of the questions that arise are to do with training. When you refer to archaic language, presumably, if it is archaic language in the language of the law, does this mean that the translators should be not necessarily legal experts, but have a good knowledge of the law, and therefore the language is not archaic as far as they're concerned? It's a specialized language, and they have to deal with. And I think this is an issue that concerns other fields. So the this issue of the archaic language, and I was very much thinking, who are the translators? Who are the translators and the interpreters? And I was also thinking about what the type of support that is or is not given to them in terms of codes of practice, in terms of codes of practice ethics. I mean, there must be situations where what the translator has got to deal with is pretty harrowing. And what support do the translators, do the interpreters get, if any? And again, I think this is a more general issue of training and stopping to see the translator and the interpreter as some kind of conduit, which is just going through the job and won't leave any emotional impact, etc. So these are the sort of questions I was what came to mind. Another one which is important from the point of view of research in translation studies, and particularly in research and interpreting, is that of data confidentiality. How is this dealt with? I mean, I had the privilege to supervise a PhD student quite a few years back who was looking at police recordings in the UK context and interrogations in a police context, and the way the data was handled was extremely stringent. I mean, he couldn't get the material. He had to go to the police station. He was allowed to listen to the recordings and transliterate quite a few things. You mentioned the fact that repetitions were not included. I mean, in his case, he had to use, I can't remember what the software is, but software which actually allows you to make the pauses visible and repetitions, etc. So, I mean, this is quite huge in terms of, I would say, the training requirements that would arise of legal translation. In more general terms, this constant interference of colloquial vernacular language and standard language of course it is a problem. It may be very visible in an Egyptian context because of diglossia, as you mentioned, but it is also an issue that arises with other languages where there is a feeling, maybe a false assumption, but it is much more standard. And I recall, for instance, interpreters working with Spanish, wondering whether, in a court setting, whether they had to interpret and render the vernacular aspect of their perhaps less educated suspect or defendant, or speak as they would normally do in Spanish. So I think this raises all those language issues. Thank you. Shall I?
Yeah.
Continue if you have other comments.
Yes, I have. Yes, I have a few things. Thank you. There was Roberta's paper as well. I mean, two things. One is that of intralingual translation, and I found this quite interesting. So I remember years ago, quite a few years ago, I did some translation work from English into French, and it was EU legislation, and I was struck by the sort of constraints I was using. I mean, I was using parallel texts, which were legislative texts in French, so produced in a French, metropolitan French context. And I was quite pleased with my effort and having looked at the real material and used the key terms. But then, when this was transported into the European context, the European Commission has its own glossary. So terms that in a French context would be in certain terms. You mentioned this was perhaps reference to, for instance, Belgian and French law. Other terms had to be found, and what was the trend that was quite interesting, and I mean this is a genuine question. I wonder whether it is happening in other legal contexts. Is that there seemed to be a strive for transparency in a European context, which meant that the language was neutralized to some extent, and you would use terms which were the term was French, but it wasn't quite the term you would have used in that context. And you can perhaps see the implications as well for language generally and the way language develops. This kind of push for standardization within a group of languages. I also would like to pick up on your comment about the assumed neutrality of legal language. I was very surprised to learn when looking at animal rights that cruelty is a legal term. And I find that cruelty it has such emotional connotation. And as I said, I learned that cruelty is actually a legal term. And of course, what animal rights supporters want to do is to make sure that welfare is also a term that acquires legal weight. So it was very interesting to hear this.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll go I guess everybody can react to everything, so...
So you want me to answer and then...
however you wish to do it, I guess the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'll first try and quickly address your point about the training. Well, I think they need legal training, definitely. So translators, who are they now? They are people like me, bilinguals. And that's not only for the Egyptian context, like also in the US, a judge once called a translator to the court, and he was the shoe salesman in Macy's before they started training. So, I mean, they think if you speak both languages, then that would be something absolutely fine. But the problem is interrogations are very high stakes. So if you do not really communicate the meaning well, the person could go to jail, could be prosecuted for something that he hasn't done, things like that. As for codes of practice and support, they don't receive anything now. And that's not only in interrogations. I've been working on a paper with a colleague of mine in Egypt, and we went to human rights offices where they deal with cases that have to be translated for NGOs abroad. And these are all very high stakes cases. And again, the translators who work for this office, they don't receive any support and they don't receive any training. So they're just given the text and that's it. Which brings me to a point you have mentioned about people who translate animal rights, and that you think they need to be activists in themselves while they deal with things like that. And I found it very interesting because translators who worked with human rights cases, they did not, when we had interviews with them, they did not identify as human rights activists. They just said it's a job, I'm paid for it, and I don't need to be involved in it, and it's similar here. It's just a source of money, if you'd like. So here ethics is something that is very dodgy at the moment, but I'm working on it. I hope. Data how confidential is it? Now the beauty and the problem of the Egyptian context is that you can get whatever information you want based on who you know, and the full information. It doesn't have to be, but then here ethics plays a role as well. So what do you do with this kind of information? And once you get hold of it, but again, the bad side of it, if you don't have any connections and you really want to work with the system, how do people look at you? Again, I'm a linguist. I'm a discourse analyst like you, and I'm not even a translator, so why am I doing this? They look at you in a very... okay, so I'll get to your talk now. As I said, what struck me is the human rights and animal rights. So how do you position yourself, and do you really think that this needs to be addressed if you are dealing with something that is very debatable? So do you need to be on a certain side while you are working on this? Because I think it's very interesting. And let me go over to the other talk, which was also very interesting, and I think it connects very well with the problems and the challenges that you have with the interrogation text as well, because you said there is a trap of looking at the terms and assuming that they mean something while they don't mean that thing, and that was one of the points of dealing with records, is that you think that the term in front of you means what you deal with every day, but then you don't. So what would you suggest for translators at this point? Do you suggest that they get trained in how to historically see how the term goes, and would that be time consuming? Because again, this is something that you need to think of when dealing with things like rights and legal contexts. It is very, you usually get your texts at a very tight deadline, and you need to make it as impactable as it needs to be. So your approach needs a lot of research, and how do you see this fitting in with the bigger context? Yeah. So that's it.
I was really very interested in both your presentations. And as for animal rights, and as you mentioned, the historical dimension also of the background of legal translation, I was thinking of animals being the beneficiaries of awqaf in Morocco. So the idea of animals having rights is rooted in the Islamic tradition in a way. Maybe it has, yes, more roots than in European tradition. For the other presentation, what I found fascinating is that it explained in the more evident way the fact that what we call legal translation is not a product, but a process. That is to say, you can go on translating the same text, depending on the use you think for it, the target, the public. So it's really a process. I think that a translation made for scientific purposes, it is obviously not a translation made for the defense. Also the constraint in time and so on are completely different. And so I found both the presentation very inspiring. I have to maybe answer something. No, I've answered. As for intralingual translation, and in particular the problem of languages in the EU, that's very normal that two languages developed, one for municipal law, I mean state law, and the other Italian. For Italian law is not the same as Italian for EU. But I don't know really if there is a kind of thought behind. It's just, I think, in a way also it depends on who's translating. For example, and the influence, I mean, we have, just to give you an example, competence. In Italian law, for us is different, the power of the judge to decide, and, for example, territorial competence. We have two different words. While in EU Italian language, you have only competence. And I think that there you find a kind of influence coming from, I wouldn't say more powerful countries, but I think that translation in EU is organized on platforms. And so if you are not the platform language, you just get the result that are given to you. And I mean, it's an institutional way of translating. So
Miriam, would you like to answer some of the points about activism and?
I mean, it's a very difficult question. Do you need to be an activist? I think we probably would have to define what is an activist. I mean, as an animal activist, are you someone who goes and tries to stop the lorries transporting live cattle across miles and miles? Or do you write something? I would think that perhaps a little like human rights, that you may start with individuals who are highly committed, who are activists, but I would assume that when the legislation gets sufficiently established and plentiful, that talking about animal rights, animal welfare will become part of the technical subjects you may translate without being an activist as such. And I assume that this is the same with human rights issues, that not all translators are necessarily activists in the strict sense, although I think that when you are a translator or interpreter, you have to have, it must be very difficult to work with material that you really don't feel disagree with. Or if I may use an anecdote, personal anecdote here, years and years ago, I'm always saying this, years and years, but it was years ago. I was working as a staff translator. I was a vegetarian at the time, and the text I was asked to deal with was about slaughterhouse implements. This was in the UK, and it was in English, and I had to render it to French. And I said, and I felt very moral and very noble, and I said, I am not dealing with this. You can't ask me to deal with slaughterhouse business. And my boss was very understanding, but I was aware at the time it was a short text. So it was quite easy to say, no, I'm not doing it, someone else will do it. I'm sure that if my employer had had a very interesting contract and agreement with the meat industry, that a translator who refused to engage with it would have been in an odd position, and I may have had to make a choice, and I suppose some translators do. In theoretical terms, you can always say, no, I am not doing this. But so, that's, I think you probably need to have some kind of belief in what you are doing, and what George, when George Steiner in After Babel talks about the hermeneutic motion and what translation entails, there is this first stage which is that of trust, and the fact you have to believe that there is something there that is worth translating, whether or not you agree with it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
If I can go back to Roberta's comment about the Islamic tradition, indeed, I mean, I think that's I didn't really have time to go through this, but there is a very well-established tradition in Persian, Arabic texts of discussing animal welfare, compassion to animals, and in ancient texts, sort of pre-Islamic as well, in some Greek texts, there are sort of injunctions to a surgeon not to make it as painless as possible towards the animal. So, it is a tradition that is there. When I remember sort of talking to someone in the organization Compassion in World Farming, which is a global enterprise, saying that he had very fruitful engagements with Muslim communities in this country. In terms of animal welfare, and he said, contrary to what many may think, this was the community which was the most prepared to discuss issues of welfare and issues of compassion, which is quite interesting because it doesn't necessarily match what we actually see on the ground, but there's kind of philosophical, ethical dimension is there. Thank you for mentioning it.
Are we ready to open it up? Are you okay? No more questions. Okay, thank you very much. What I found interesting in these three talks actually was that we have text, and then we have the actors around the text, and the actors. Some of them are translators, and some of them are quite distant in terms of history, and it's always across several languages. So I guess what we have come together to, and I've brought up our call for papers, just in case I'd forgotten what we came here to talk about. So, the questions we asked was, what is the impact of translation on the diffusion of legal concepts between domains of discourse? And we've had several domains already here. Does the translation of legal terminology modify the perception of the corresponding legal phenomena in observable and applied ways? And Naveen also mentioned the musalsalat, which I know Gianluca is interested in. So that's a modification. How are words translated from legal discourse into everyday discourse, and does translation happen in the other direction? So we've already had this, Roberta talking about the everyday discourse, and you're talking about cruelty and that how whether or not that can be affected by the legal discourse somehow influencing it. So now we have 27 minutes to talk in a general way. We will take questions. We have roving mics. Yes, so could we start off with Professor Al-Wazna?
Okay, so first of all, actually, I'd like to thank the organizer for this fascinating conference. Very much actually fascinated with the three presentations. I've got a question for the first presenter and a comment for the third one. So, if we actually consider the animal terms kind of culture-specific statements or culture-bound statements, you know that several translation scholars, among whom are Newmark, Vanuti, Sasevich, and others, have actually given three options for the translation of such terms. The first one is basically the foreignizing, which means that it's a doublet translation. So the source term is going to be transliterated, followed by some sort of description by definition or explanation. The second option is the domesticating, which means that the translator is going actually to provide a culture-specific equivalent, which is adaptable to the cultural setting and the target language. And the third one, which Susan Sasevich actually has focused on particularly, is basically the neutralism, i.e. trying to sort of apply what we call descriptive paraphrases. So basically the source text will be paraphrased using sort of simple words in the target language. So which option do you think is probably appropriate for the translation of the animal sort of terms? The comment, so this is the question. The comment for the professor, the third professor, is you've mentioned urf, which is translated in general as customs, and I do totally agree that it's not part and parcel of Islamic law as far as the primary sources of Islamic law are concerned, which is Al-Quran and the prophetic traditions, and then other two sources come in light, which are al-ijma', mutual consent, and then al-qiyas, which is analogy. Then another layer of two sources come into light, which are the independent reasoning, or personal reasoning, which is al-ijtihad and al-urf. And I'll give you two examples for al-urf. First one is what the Prophet, peace be upon him, actually did with some of the sheikhs of different tribes, that he has approved quite a lot of the practices that they've been actually practicing in their tribes, because they are in line with the Islamic traditions. So he didn't really object to them, rather he approved them, and these are actually urf in these tribes or are practices that they've been practicing for a long time. The second example is probably what was happening in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia regarding the driving of women. Although this is not part of Islam, rather, the wife of the Prophet was riding on a camel, which means on her own, which means for the women not to drive is, I don't want to say that it's against Islam, but it has nothing to do with Islam at all. But it was, applied in Saudi for a very, very long time, until the current crown prince has come, may God bless him, and has actually given the opportunity for women to drive, showing that, well, what happened or what used to happen is urf, and we didn't really deny it because it's a part of law, but now we have to admit that Islam is not against this, so women can drive if they want, and he puts, some sort of conditions that, women need to meet in order to be able to drive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take one more question and then we'll have the answer. So, could you introduce yourself, please, when you...
Thank you very much. I think it was a lively discussion. I'm just wondering, Arabic legal discourse, there is something similar like we have in Anglo-American, broadly similar, but slightly different. For example, case of judicial review, which is in English law is a part of administrative law, but in the case of the American, the constitution law, I would imagine. And the creativity of law, like the present decision of the House of Lords or the Supreme Court in case of the prorogation of the parliamentacy, where a new sort of example, a creative law. I wonder if similar sort of thing appears in other Arabic legal jurisdiction, whether there is some sort of creativity of law, or whether it goes against the religious prohibition or something. I would like to know the panel view on that.
You have a question?
Yeah, I think she has.
Zaki, okay, so one more question.
Thank you very much. Few things. I relate to what Bertha said. كلية القانون, كلية الحقوق. We have this change from كلية القانون from كلية الحقوق إلى كلية القانون. I don't know for what reason back home. Also, mentioned the law in Palestine about the animal rights. قانون الرفق بالحيوان, قانون رعاية الحيوان. So this is what is, why from رعاية to رفق? I understand from background that the convention is رفق بالحيوان. When it first started, I think probably in the 60s, the concept got attention. And now we have رعاية, and this is the problem in the Arab world of standardizing terms. They started by standard terms, and now they just do things with what was historically conventional. Also, what Roberta said about talaq and tatliq, this is interesting. It's interesting what Arabs do with this thing for derivation. Well, we all know talaq, but tatliq is something different. In the Maghreb, you find these things. For example, in Libya, we say ishraq. In Tunisia, they say tashriq. For example, ishraq al-mar'a, enabling women. In Tunisia, they say tashriq. Both they come from both come from the same stem, but they just use it differently, and also other terms. And what I need to know more is about shiqaq, by the way. Also about the women, the animal rights. There was a debate some time ago about giving human rights to apes, because biologically, science proves they are our cousins. Are you aware of this? Of course. You are, okay. Last thing is for Naveen, about the punctuation. Actually, this is something very well known, that Arabic uses lexis, while English uses codes. Arabic uses wa, amma, and so on, for as a discourse connectivity. But English uses codes like comma, like a semicolon. For a professional translator, this is no problem. Immediately he or she will know that instead of using wa and like the text you've shown us, he or she would use punctuation. But for someone who is novice translator, or probably, I mean, we deal with this with beginners, students who just started learning the language. Thank you very much.
Right, I will take up the question about the translation strategies. I think my answer would be that it really depends on what you are translating and who you are translating it for. So there's the whole issue of text type, text function, target audience. And this is going to impact on the terms you choose. So, looking at, for instance, the way SPARE, the Egyptian organization, packages its message, they want to have an impact on the public. People are going to listen if they talk of, if they use concepts that don't contradict perhaps their religious beliefs, I assume. And rifq, it's difficult to object to rifq, compassion. I think in general terms. But if you are inputting this into a legal text, I am not sure, and I'm not at all a legal expert, but I'm not sure that either compassion or rifq can be very helpful. And this is where something needs, for instance, perhaps a term such as welfare, which is has become a scientific term, and I mean it's indeed an example of perhaps general language that has become specific. Because with regard to animal rights, welfare, I mentioned very briefly the 5 freedoms. In order to ensure animal welfare, and mostly in the context of the agribusiness, you have to ensure that 5 freedoms are granted to the animal. So it is a scientific term that presumably acquires legal weight. So the choice of term, whether you talk of rifq and compassion in protection organizations, or whether you talk of, welfare, there isn't really an equivalent in Arabic so far. I mean, there are several equivalents. I mean, this is why it's a bit of terminological fuzziness for the time being. But this you can see in lots of other fields where, for instance, organizations which are calling for donations or for support of worthy causes will use a language which is not that of the legal experts. Where they have answered your question here. So whether, you mentioned domestication, whether the term riaya is more of a domestication than rifq. Maybe because it's not as used, but it has begun to appear. You do see it in text in Arabic.
but الرفق بالحيوان does collocate in Arabic, whereas the latter doesn't. You know, رعاية can actually have different sort of you know, meanings. You could say تحت رعاية blah 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 blah. I don't think that رعاية is really the most appropriate.
I think we can go into specificities maybe later, and we can return to another comment. But let's just hear the answers first.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. I think there was sometimes, sorry, the question, I think this was the question, you know, about riaya and protection. I'd like to make two general comments. One is that language changes, and what doesn't collocate now might do in 10 years' time. If we look at the language we're using now compared to what was admissible 20 years ago, you know, language is alive, something that moves. In the same way, the dichotomy human rights, non-animal rights, as the term seems to be gaining ground, I think it's probably useful to see it as a continuum. I'm aware that there are, you know, very kind of religious, philosophical underpinnings to starting to talk of rights to non-humans, but you could also argue that maybe 100 years ago, women were not given the same rights that men, you know, black people in the context of slavery were not considered as fully fledged human beings, and so on and so forth. So I think perhaps what I'd like to retain here is this kind of constant movement that, you know, in the way concepts evolve. Okay.
Thank you. Do you have any more responses?
Yes, I just want to answer your comments. That's the point, is that they call people who are not translators at all to translate. So they're not even novice translators. They have no idea about linguistics or translation, which makes it problematic. And another thing, that I'm not looking at it only from the translation point of view, also as an analyst who is taking this text, okay, and trying to realize whether this whole list of ands, was it the contribution of the clerk, or was it just an Arabic text like in legal books, for example? It's very common that you have this whole 2 or 3 or 4 pages of one sentence just connected, as you were saying. So that's the point. I am aware that any novice translator would know that, but then they don't call translators, and hence the importance of getting translators.
You said they bring bilingual.
Just a bilingual.
Well, I mean,
bilingualism
is not a big count for someone to be a
exactly. That's the point. Yes. Thank you.
I think Roberta has a
Yes. Well, I will not comment on comments, but because I thank you for that comment, because it made me understand that I emphasized the separateness of the 3 domains because of it was my concern at that moment. That is to say, I wanted to underline that there is no common concept. But this does not mean that the 3 domains have relations. As in European languages, you have law and ethics. They are separate. Nevertheless, they have relations in a way. And so I thank you very much, because of course Urf has relations with Sharia and also with the way Qanun is applied. But anyway, okay, that's all. Are Arab lawyers creative? Well, I think they are. But the problem for lawyers is not to be individually creative, but to impose their creations And not always lawyers have the power to do that.
The judicial system.
Yes, but anyway, maybe Professor Parolin could add interesting comments on this issue about for example, judicial review in the U.S. sense. Europeans just imitated that model. It was not created by them, but they added something, maybe. And so I think the same. I mean, the novelties are very rare. But I think that everybody cooperate and have a chance. It was very interesting, the observation about Kulliyat al-Qanun. Actually, al-Qanun is expanding. So one can say al-Qanun al-Islami also, which sounds as al-Qanun al-Tabi'i. Is contradictory, but it is used. And as lawyers are interested in reality, it's there, Qanun Tabi'i. Then the different, on the dissolution of marriage, talaq is the same word everywhere. But other ways of marriage dissolution differs in their content and in their verbal form. So there are really many. Tatliq is the way used in Morocco, but fasakh, for example, in many other countries. Shiqaq is a new, but at the same time very ancient way of dissolution. And as shiqaq, the way was designed by the Moroccan code, is really egalitarian. It is open on the same in the same way to wife and husband. It's really well. I'm not explaining shiqaq in details because I think it's not the issue this evening.
Maybe you can talk about it over
Yes.
dinner. Yeah.
Yes.
So good for the appetite. I think we have time for one more question or two if they're very short. Yeah, Rana?
First, I would like to thank all the speakers for the very enlightening presentation. And I have a question for Dr. Nadine. Since you've worked on a very sensitive and critical style, so do you think that translating in the legal domain allows the translator much agency and freedom as to turning fragmented language into complete sentences or rounding of ungrammatical utterances or simplifying technical terms as much as is actually happening in other contexts of language use such as the media and the press?
Okay, thank you for the question. I can only speak about the Egyptian context, and the short answer is no. Because actually, after translating, the prosecutor has to read the translation and approve or disapprove of the translation. So this restricts it, especially if the translation is for like a disputed case between the Egyptian side and another, for example, foreign side. Then you are only hearing the official institutional form of what's going on in the room. So no. And that's why part of it, again, the way we approach this kind of context is with the idea of, well, you're probably doing it for a good cause, but you're doing it not in a really good way, so how about we train your people to do it so and so and so. So this is where training becomes very important. We can talk about this more.
Okay. Sorry, there's one question in the back. Could we have it very short so that we have room for the last question? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Siraj Khan. I'm from the Max Planck Foundation. I'm a lawyer by training, so I'm not an expert on language or linguistics. The point I wanted to get your clarification on is when you translate terms such as Sharia Qanun, for example, to what extent do you take into account the process by which that thing becomes what it is being described as? So, for example, the process by which something becomes a qanun or something becomes part of a masum or la'iha or something like that. These are generally dictated, or the translation I assume would be dictated by the process by which it comes about. And this is what I found in my it's more observational. It's from my interaction with both judges, lawyers, and translators at the same time, is that they're often missing the context by which something becomes a legal statute. I mean, we have the same in English. We have statutes, legislation, law, act, treaty. It's largely dictated by the process. And to what extent do you think that is what is necessary in order to clarify? And the point I just, if you'd allow me, the issue on standardization. Anyone who has ever tried to install an Arabic keyboard on a computer will know that there's like 15 types of Arabic. To this day, I don't know what the difference is between them. But this idea of standardization, maybe it's possible that I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, whether we need to move away from standardization and more localization. Because again, certain countries like Jordan, for example, still have parts of the Majalla in their laws today, but they come from a French civil code background. The majority of other laws. But you don't, unless you know that context, you don't know how the terminology is going to affect the way that thing is being applied. Thank you.
Could we have the other question, please, here in front, Hanem? Thank you, Leia.
Thank you so much. I just have one quick question for Nadine and a comment as well as in the point of continuation and as well as application. The question is training. You mentioned training for farming. What sort of training? Is it something you're already working on or do you envisage to work on? And as far as the punctuation, repetition, I think it's not as easy as how to be here mentioned. It's not as a straightforward thing to deal with, especially if we go back to readers that have been published by Mansour, English out of English translation, and it was full of repetition and full of ands and wows, and all of them are represented again in the translation into English. The point here is not about this is straightforward, it's about the information you know in the Arabic and how you deal with it. So you said you are a linguist, an analyst, and this is your point. But also for the translator, they need to be a linguist, an analyst, to know how to structure it, to restructure the text. So using the and or getting rid of and quickly is not as straightforward as it is. It really is something to read, to know how to deal with. So it's just a quick. I'm sorry, I'm tired, so that's why my voice is
Yes, so this will be the last round, so if you
can... Very quickly.
Yeah.
Training, I'm already working on training. I've started training prosecutors, but that's a different story, not specifically on translation, but on asking questions and how questions could be more productive. From there, we started getting the people who they assign as translators and checking whether they are okay and whether they are like what kinds of things can they offer for them, what kind of linguistic training do they need, and so on and so forth. We're just starting, so it's on a very small scale, but hopefully this will continue on a bigger scale later on. As for the comment, yes, I agree with you, but I was not dealing with me as a linguist, but only as a translator, they don't get translators. So even if it was a straightforward thing, which I don't believe it is, but still it's problematic, even if it's a straightforward thing. Thank you.
As for the term al-qanun, in general, legal terms, it depends on the context, because even outside the translation process, but legal terms can be used in different meanings according to the context. So qanun can be understood as any rule coming from the state, which is imposed by the state. But if we are discussing about constitutional process, it's clear that qanun is not marsum, and in certain countries the word qanun is not used. It can be used nizam, but in other contexts I would refer to nizam as qanun. It depends on the generality of the discourse.
I had something about language rights. I think trying to trace back. Perhaps going back to your talk, Nadine, I think that it is generally accepted that language is a human right, that you have the right, certainly, again, going back to the European Union and the multilingualism and the right to write in your own language, etc. But organizations such as Amnesty International as well have taken on the language rights issue, access, being able to understand what text, what is being submitted to you, etc. And I was just wondering whether when transcripts are so, are not as rigorous as they should be, whether in some way it's not, it's the language rights of the various parties which are at stake as well. And mostly the defendants or the accused in the process. So I think there is very much, very wide issue of language rights at stake there.
So thank you for that comment, and that will be something we can continue to discuss in the presentations tomorrow, which again many people who are not presenting have also registered for. I'd just like to say, in case you are leaving us today, that there is a sign-up sheet over there on that table. So if you do want to look, if you are interested in what the governance program is doing, then you can leave your email address on those sign-up sheets, and you will get an announcement when the next events come. Or you can also, as well as, pick up a leaflet which has details of our forthcoming events in the theme governance and language. So this will give you details on our forthcoming events. There's so you can have a look at that. And finally, I'll just say thank you very much to our panelists this evening. And we look forward to continue to learning from